The wind in Redemption Gulch had a texture. It was not the clean, scouring wind of the high plains, but a gritty, mineral-heavy thing that carried the dust of the surrounding claims and the fine, powdered rock coughed up from the stamping mill. It coated the tongue, settled in the lines around the eyes, and gave the unforgiving sun a hazy, jaundiced glare. On that particular afternoon, the wind was a restless accomplice to the town's cruel stillness. At the edge of the dusty track that served as the main street, beside the mud-caked wheels of the noon stagecoach, a woman stood alone. She was a small, slight figure, made smaller by the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched out in every direction. Her name was May, though no one in the gulch had bothered to learn it. To them she was simply the Chinese woman, the wife of the labourer who had been crushed in a shoring collapse at the Argent Queen mine 2 days prior. She wore a dress of dark blue silk, a garment utterly out of place in this world of canvas and rough-spun wool. It was frayed at the cuffs and stained with the alkali dust of the road, a remnant of a life that no longer existed. Her feet were bare, the soles already raw from the baked, unforgiving earth. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her hands, the sum of her worldly possessions. She did not weep. She did not move. She simply stood, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the heat-shimmering horizon, her stillness a stark rebuke to the town's gawking curiosity. The whispers followed the wind. Men leaning in the shade of the assayer's office murmured to one another. Women peered from behind twitching curtains in the clappered houses that lined the street. They saw not a widow in the throes of grief, but a problem, an inconvenience. Mr. Alastair Sterling, the owner of the Argent Queen and effectively the owner of the town, had made his position clear. The labourer's contract was terminated by his death. The debt he had incurred for passage and supplies was his alone. The woman was no longer the company's concern. She had been given until the stagecoach arrived to vacate the small, company-owned shack she had shared with her husband. Sheriff Brodie emerged from his office, his tin star a dull spot on his sweat-stained vest. He was a man whose authority was leased from Sterling, not earned from the people. His face was fleshy and perpetually weary, his movements slow, as if he were wading through the thick, hot air. He stopped a few feet from May, careful not to get too close. "You need to move on," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion save impatience. "The stage is leaving. You can't just stand here." May did not look at him. Her focus remained distant, her posture rigid with a dignity that seemed to infuriate the sheriff. She had not spoken a word since the company foreman had emptied her husband's pockets and handed her 3 thin dimes, the final settlement of his account. "Did you hear me?" Brodie's voice grew louder, drawing more eyes. "There's nothing for you here. Get on the stage or start walking. I don't care which." Still she was silent. Her silence was a wall he could not breach, a quiet defiance that pricked at his borrowed authority. He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the worn grip of his pistol, a gesture of ingrained habit rather than genuine threat. The crowd watched, a collective witness to a humiliation that was becoming a public spectacle. They felt a flicker of pity, perhaps, but it was quickly smothered by the practicalities of their own harsh lives. Helping her would mean crossing Sterling, and no one in Redemption Gulch was foolish enough to do that. From the far end of the street, leaning against the support post of the general store's covered porch, a man watched the scene unfold. His name was Tyne. He was a homesteader from the high country, a man who came to town only when necessity demanded it, his visits as brief and silent as possible. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built of the same hard, unyielding material as the mountains he called home. His face was weathered into a mask of stoic reserve, his eyes the colour of a winter sky, missing nothing. He had seen May before on his rare trips into town. He had seen her with her husband, a man whose shoulders were permanently bowed from his work underground. They had always been quiet, keeping to themselves, navigating the town's casual hostility with a shared silent fortitude. Tyne had recognized in them a solitude that mirrored his own, though theirs was born of circumstance and his was of choice. Now, watching her stand alone against the weight of the town's indifference, something stirred in him. It was not pity. Pity was a soft, useless emotion he had burned out of himself years ago, along with his grief. What he felt was a cold, hard anger, the kind that settled deep in the gut. He saw the calculated cruelty of Sterling's decree and the lazy cowardice of Sheriff Brody enforcing it. He saw a world that would grind a person down to nothing, and then discard the dust. It was the same world that had taken his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Lily, in a fever that had swept through their cabin like a wildfire, leaving him with nothing but the silence and the ghosts. He pushed himself off the post, his movements economical and deliberate. The leather of his worn boots made no sound in the thick dust as he crossed the street. The crowd parted for him slightly, their gazes shifting from the woman to the quiet man from the mountains. Tyne was not a man people spoke to casually. There was an aura of profound stillness about him, a sense of a life lived so far from others that he had become a piece of the wilderness itself. He did not approach May directly. He stopped in front of Sheriff Brody, his height casting a long shadow over the smaller man. He did not speak immediately, simply looked at the sheriff with those flat grey eyes until Brody shifted his weight, his bluster deflating under the silent scrutiny. "She's got to move, Tyne," Brody said, a defensive edge to his voice. "Sterling's orders." Tyne's gaze flickered to May for a brief second, taking in the frayed silk, the bare feet, the unyielding line of her back. He saw not a fragile woman, but a piece of tempered steel. His eyes returned to Brody. "I need a cook," Tyne said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound unused to forming words. "The cabin needs tending." It was not an appeal or a request. It was a statement of fact delivered with the finality of a nail being driven into wood. Brody blinked, confused. The entire town knew Tyne lived alone, had for 5 years. He cooked his own food, mended his own clothes, and kept his own counsel. "You're hiring her?" the sheriff asked, incredulous. "I need help," Tyne repeated, the words costing him an obvious effort. He turned his head slightly, his gaze now falling on May. He did not soften his expression. He did not offer a comforting smile. He addressed her with the same blunt practicality he had shown the sheriff. "My place is warm, there's food, you work, you eat." He held out a hand, not to her but palm up, an offering of a simple hard bargain. For the first time May's focus shifted. Her dark eyes moved from the distant horizon and settled on his face. She searched his features, looking past the weathered skin and the grim set of his jaw. She saw no kindness there, no charity. She saw something far more valuable, a complete absence of contempt. He was looking at her as a person capable of work, not as a piece of refuse to be swept away. Her eyes dropped to his calloused, empty hand, then back to his face. The town held its breath, waiting. The moment stretched, thin and taut. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she gave a single, sharp nod. It was a gesture of acceptance, but also of profound exhaustion, the last act of a will that had been tested to its absolute limit. Tyne dropped his hand. He looked back at Sheriff Brody. "The matter is settled." He turned and walked toward his wagon, which was parked near the general store, laden with sacks of flour, salt, and beans. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. He heard the faint whisper of her bare feet in the dust behind him, a sound as soft and persistent as falling snow. As they passed the silent, staring townspeople, a coin, one of the foreman's 3 dimes, slipped from her tightly clenched fist and fell into the dust with a barely audible click. Tyne paused, bent down and picked it up without breaking stride. He pressed the small, thin piece of metal into her palm, closing her fingers around it. It was not a gift. It was a restoration. They left Redemption Gulch behind them, the wagon wheels cutting deep ruts in the dusty road. The town shrank in the haze, its judgment and its cruelty fading with the distance. they were two solitary figures heading toward a shared solitude, the silence between them as vast and profound as the empty sky above. The journey to Tyne's homestead was a long, slow climb out of the basin where the town festered and up into the high country. The air grew thinner and cooler, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth instead of sulphur and coal smoke. The landscape changed from scarred ochre hills to slopes thick with ponderosa and aspen, their roots clinging to granite bones. Tyne handled the team of mules with a quiet, competent hand, his attention fixed on the trail ahead. He did not speak, and May did not expect him to. She sat on the wagon bench, her back straight, the cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap. She watched the unfamiliar terrain roll by, her mind a blank slate, wiped clean by shock and exhaustion. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness were the only sounds, a lulling cadence that slowly eased the rigid tension in her shoulders. The coin Tyne had returned to her was still clutched in her hand, a small solid weight against her skin. His homestead was nestled in a small, high meadow, protected on three sides by a dense stand of timber and a sheer rock face that caught the last of the afternoon sun. The cabin was not large, but it was built to endure. The logs were thick and perfectly notched, the chinking between them clean and tight. A stone chimney rose from the cedar-shingled roof, solid and square. It was a fortress, a bulwark against the wind, the snow, and the world below. A small, sturdy barn stood a short distance away, and a split-rail fence enclosed a patch of ground that looked to have been a garden once, though it was now overgrown with weeds. Tyne brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. "We're here," he said, the two words sounding loud in the immense quiet of the mountains. He unhitched the mules and led them toward the barn without another glance at her. May slid down from the wagon seat, her bare feet sinking into the cool, soft earth of the meadow. The air here was different, alive. She could hear the hum of insects, the distant call of a hawk. After the dead, dusty air of the gulch, it was like taking a breath for the first time in days. She followed him to the cabin door. He pushed it open and stepped inside, leaving it for her to follow. The interior was dark and cool. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. A single large room served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a thick wool blanket, was tucked into a corner. The space was Spartan, functional, and utterly devoid of any softening touch. It was the home of a man who did not live so much as he existed. Tyne moved to the fireplace, striking a match and setting the kindling ablaze. Light and warmth began to push back the shadows. "There is a loft," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a wooden ladder leading to the space above. "You can sleep there." He began to unload the supplies from the wagon, carrying the heavy sacks inside and stacking them neatly against a wall. May stood for a moment in the center of the room, her small bundle held before her. Then she set it carefully on the table and began to work. Her movements were as economical and deliberate as his own. She found a broom made of bound twigs and began to sweep the floor, her motions fluid and efficient. She located a bucket and, finding the well outside, drew fresh water. A silent rhythm established itself over the next few days, a routine built not on words, but on shared tasks and mutual observation. Tyne would rise before dawn, his heavy boots on the floorboards the only alarm. He would tend to the mules, chop wood, and then head out to check his trap lines or hunt, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He would return in the late afternoon, leaving a brace of rabbits or a grouse on the porch without comment. May, in turn, transformed the cabin's interior. She scoured the cast-iron pots until they shone. She found his neglected mending basket and repaired his clothes with stitches so fine, and even they were nearly invisible. She took the overgrown patch of land and, using a spade she found in the barn, began to clear it, her hands quickly becoming calloused. She cooked. The meals she prepared from the simple ingredients at hand, flour, beans, dried meat, and the wild onions and berries she found in the woods. were more flavorful and nourishing than anything Tyne had eaten in 5 years. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language and culture was too wide, and both were accustomed to silence. Yet a form of communication began to grow between them. One morning he left a new pair of sturdy leather boots by the door, her approximate size. She put them on and they fit perfectly. She thanked him by mending a tear in his heavy coat with a patch so skillfully applied it looked like part of the original design. He noticed she shivered in the cool mountain evenings, her silk dress offering no protection. On his next trip to the Gulch, a trip he made alone, leaving her the security of the isolated cabin, he returned with a bolt of thick grey wool flannel. He left it on the table without a word. Within a week she had sewn herself a practical warm dress and shirt, working by firelight long after he had gone to bed. They learned about each other through small, observed details. He saw the way she would sometimes pause in her work and stare east, her expression unreadable, and knew she was thinking of the home she had lost. She saw the way his hands, so strong and capable when holding an axe or a rifle, would sometimes hesitate before touching the small carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece, and knew it was a link to the family he never mentioned. He was a man hollowed out by grief. She was a woman unmoored by tragedy. In their shared solitude the silence was not empty. It was a space where two broken lives could exist, without the need for explanation or justification. It was a quiet acknowledgement of survival. The first snow came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that turned to a thick, wet blanket overnight. It was a warning of the winter to come, a sign that the high country was preparing to seal itself off from the world below. Tyne had been out since dawn, checking the last of his high-ridge trap lines, hoping to secure a few more pelts before the heavy storms made the passes impassable. The sky had been a clear, cold blue when he left, but by midday it had turned the colour of lead, the clouds descending to swallow the peaks. May watched the storm roll in from the cabin window. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the wooden shutters. Snow began to fall in earnest, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent. She kept the fire roaring, the flames casting dancing shadows across the room. She had a pot of stew simmering over the heat, the rich smell of rabbit and root vegetables filling the small space. But as the afternoon bled into a dark, premature evening, a cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. He should have been back hours ago. It was well past dark when she heard it, a heavy stumbling sound on the porch, followed by the thud of a body slumping against the door. She rushed to unlatch it, pulling with all her strength against the force of the wind. Tyne fell inside, half sprawling across the threshold. He was covered in snow, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and ragged. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the thigh of his canvas trousers. She managed to drag him inside and get the door barred against the storm. She pulled him closer to the fire, the heat melting the snow from his clothes and revealing the extent of his injury. There was a deep, vicious gash in his leg, running from his knee to his thigh, the edges raw and swollen. It was a wound from a fall, a sharp rock or a broken branch. "Trap line," he rasped, his teeth chattering. "Slipped on the ridge, leg gave out." He was already burning with fever, his skin was hot and dry to the touch. May's face was a mask of calm, focused intensity. The fragility that the townspeople of Redemption Gulch had seen in her was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She had seen sickness before. She had seen death. She would not let it take this house too. Working quickly, she used his hunting knife to slice away the fabric of his trousers. She washed the wound with hot water and soap, her touch gentle but firm. Tyne gritted his teeth, his body rigid with pain, but he did not cry out. From her own small bundle she retrieved a small lacquered box. Inside was a packet of dried herbs, a poultice her grandmother had taught her to make, and a fine curved needle with a spool of silk thread. She had brought them from her village, a tiny piece of her old life she had managed to keep. She stitched the wound closed, her fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. He watched her through a haze of pain and fever, marveling at the skill in her small hands. When she was done, she applied the poultice and bound the leg tightly with strips of clean cloth. She helped him to his bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets over him. But the fever did not break. It climbed higher, plunging him into a delirious state. For 3 days and 3 nights the blizzard raged outside, and the fever raged within him. May became his tireless guardian. She kept the fire blazing, melting snow for water. She forced broth between his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. She changed the dressing on his wound, her expression grim as she fought back the infection. She sat in a chair by his bedside, sleeping only in brief, fitful snatches, her hand often resting on his forehead to gauge the heat. In his delirium, the walls he had built around his heart crumbled. He spoke names she had never heard, his voice thick with a grief that was raw and new. "Sarah," he would murmur, his eyes searching the shadows of the room. "The fire is too low, my love." And then, with a heartbreaking tenderness, "Lily, don't run so far, little bird. Stay where I can see you." May listened to the ghosts that haunted the cabin. She heard the story of his lost family not in a single narrative, but in fragmented whispers of love and loss. She learned of a wife who loved the wildflowers in the meadow, and a daughter with hair the color of summer hay. She understood now that his solitude was not a choice, but a penance. He was a man living in the ruins of a life that had been stolen from him. On the 4th morning the storm broke. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding against the new snow, streamed through the window. And in the bed, Tyne's fever broke with it. He woke to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the gentle bubbling of a pot. His head was clear for the first time in days. He felt weak, his body aching, but the fire in his veins was gone. He turned his head and saw May asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on her arms, which were folded on the edge of his bed. She looked exhausted, her face pale and thin in the morning light, but she was there. A profound, unfamiliar emotion welled up in his chest. It was a feeling he thought had died with his family, a painful, powerful surge of gratitude that was almost indistinguishable from love. She stirred, sensing his wakefulness, and her eyes opened. They were dark with fatigue, but when they met his, there was a flicker of relief. "The fever is gone," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "You saved my life," he said, his own voice hoarse. It was not an exaggeration. He knew how quickly a wound like that, left untended in the wild, could turn fatal. She simply nodded, accepting his statement as a fact. In the quiet of the sunlit cabin, with the world outside hushed and white, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a space of shared solitude, but one of shared history. The storm had been a crucible, and it had forged a new bond between them. Later that day, as he sat propped up in bed, his bandaged leg resting on a pillow, he found himself speaking of them. He told her about Sarah, his wife, how they had built the cabin together with their own hands. He told her about Lily, his daughter, and how she used to chase butterflies in the meadow. He spoke of the fever, the helplessness of watching them fade away, the crushing weight of the silence they left behind. When he was finished, his voice raw with unshed tears, the cabin was quiet for a long time. Then May began to speak. In her careful, formal English, she told him of her own past. She spoke of her village in the Guangdong province, a place of green rice paddies and the smell of the sea. She told him of the famine, of the crushing debt that had forced her husband to sign a contract with the recruiters for the Gold Mountain. They had dreamed of earning enough to return home and buy a small plot of land. It was a dream that had died with him in the dark, greedy earth of the Argent Queen mine. They were no longer just a man and a woman, bound by a practical arrangement. They were Tyne and May, 2 survivors who had looked into the abyss of each other's grief and had not turned away. The last of the walls between them had fallen, swept away by the blizzard and the truth. The winter held the high country in its icy grip for months. a time of isolation that deepened the bond between Tyne and May. He healed slowly, his strength returning day by day. He taught her how to track animals in the snow, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. She, in turn, taught him the names of the constellations her father had shown her, stars that looked down on her lost home just as they did on this new, strange one. They began to teach each other words. He would point to an object, axe, fire, bread, and she would repeat it, then offer the word in her own tongue. It was a slow, patient exchange that began to bridge the gap between their two worlds. The cabin, once a monument to his grief, became a home again, filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the quiet, hopeful presence of a shared future. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow receded, unveiling a meadow green with new life. The air grew warm, and the streams, swollen with meltwater, sang a boisterous song. May had claimed the overgrown garden patch as her own. With seeds Tyne had purchased on his last trip to town, she planted rows of beans, squash, and corn, tending the small shoots with a gentle, determined hand. Life was returning to the homestead, both outside and within. It was on a bright, clear afternoon in late May that their fragile peace was shattered. Tyne was splitting wood near the barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the meadow, when he saw the riders. There were 3 of them coming up the trail from the gulch. He knew at once who they were. The man in the lead, dressed in a fine city coat and a bowler hat that looked absurd in the rugged landscape, was Alistair Sterling. Tyne lowered his axe, his body going still. He watched them approach, his face settling into its familiar, unreadable mask. May came to the doorway of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes wide with a fear he had not seen in months. He gave her a short, sharp gesture with his head. Go inside. Bar the door. She hesitated for a second, then obeyed, the solid sound of the wooden bar sliding into place echoing across the meadow. Sterling and his 2 hired men, rough-looking characters with pistols strapped to their hips, reined in their horses a few yards from Tyne. Sterling surveyed the homestead with a proprietary air, his lips curling into a sneer. He noted the neat stacks of firewood, the smoke curling from the chimney, the vibrant green of May's garden. "Well, well," Sterling said, his voice slick with condescension. "You've been busy. It seems my property has been put to good use." Thane did not rise to the bait. He leaned the axe against the chopping block and stood, his hands loose at his sides. "This is my land, Sterling. You're trespassing." "Your land?" Sterling chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. A dubious claim at best. "But I'm not here about the land. I'm here for what belongs to me. I've come for the woman." "She doesn't belong to you," Tyne said, his voice low and flat, but with an undercurrent of cold fury that made one of the hired men shift nervously in his saddle. "Oh, but she does," Sterling said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "Her husband, the late Mr. Chen, signed an indenture contract. His passage, his supplies, his housing, all were advanced against his future labor. The contract clearly states that in the event of his death, the debt passes to his next of kin. She is his next of kin. She owes the Argent Queen Mining Company 5 years of service. I have been patient, but my patience has run out." He saw it all then. Sterling had let them be through the winter, confident the mountain would hold them prisoner. Now that the passes were clear, he had come to collect. He viewed May not as a person, but as a debt on a ledger, an asset to be reclaimed. "She is not a slave," Tyne said, the words coming out like chips of granite. "She is a debtor," Sterling corrected him smoothly, "and I am her creditor. However, I am a reasonable man. I can see she has skills. She keeps a nice house. I'm willing to overlook the months she has been squatting on your land. I will cancel the indenture." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "For a price, $200, a small fee for her contract, and I will consider the matter closed." It was a cruel, impossible demand. $200 was more money than Tyne saw in a year. It was a sum designed to be refused, a way for Sterling to maintain the veneer of legality while getting exactly what he wanted. Tyne's gaze did not waver. He looked at the smug, arrogant man on the expensive horse. a man who believed the world and everyone in it could be bought and sold. He thought of the home May had built inside the cabin's walls, the warmth she had brought back to his frozen life. He thought of her quiet strength, her resilience, the trust she had placed in him. That trust was a sacred thing, more real and more valuable than any piece of paper Sterling could produce. No, Tyne said, the single word was absolute. It was not a point of negotiation, it was a closed door. Sterling's face darkened, his mask of civility slipping. You are making a grave mistake. You are harboring a fugitive from a legal contract. I have the law on my side. Sheriff Brody does what I tell him to do. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. And my claim on her is stronger than your claim on this land. A few words to the territorial judge, a few dollars in the right pockets, and you'll find yourself with nothing. No land, no home, nothing. He straightened up, gathering his reins. I will give you until the end of the week. Have the woman or the money ready. If you don't, I will be back, and I will bring the law with me. He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They rode away, leaving a trail of churned mud and the stench of their threats hanging in the clean mountain air. Tyne stood motionless until they were out of sight, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He had defied Sterling. He had chosen to protect May, and in doing so he had declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. The quiet life he had built for them was now balanced on the edge of a knife. The week passed in a state of tense, unspoken vigilance. Tyne worked with a feverish intensity, his axe and rifle always within reach. May continued her daily routines, but a shadow of fear had returned to her eyes. They both knew Sterling would be true to his word. The end of the week arrived with a cold, grey morning that promised rain. They were eating their breakfast in silence when the sound they had been dreading reached them, the jingle of harnesses and the heavy tread of horses on the trail. Tyne rose from the table, took his rifle from the pegs above the door, and stepped outside. May was right behind him, her face pale but her expression resolute. She would not hide. This was her home too. This time there were 4 riders. Sterling was there, along with his 2 thugs. The 4th man was Sheriff Brody, his face a miserable portrait of a man caught between his conscience and his payroll. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, a warrant challenging the markers on Taine's land claim. Taine, Brody began, his voice strained, avoiding Taine's eyes. I have a legal order here. There's been a complaint filed about your claim. We have to inspect your corner posts. It was a transparent pretext, a legal crowbar to pry them out of their home. Sterling smirked, dismounting from his horse. He strode toward the cabin, his gaze fixing on May. Your time playing house is over, he said to her, his tone oozing triumph. You've caused this good man a great deal of trouble, but you can make it right. Come with me now, and I'll see that his land claim is refiled correctly. Taine stepped forward, placing himself between Sterling and May. He held the rifle loosely, its barrel pointed at the ground, but its presence was a clear and deadly statement. She is not going anywhere, Taine said, his voice dangerously quiet. You can't fight this, Brody pleaded, waving the papers. It's the law, Taine. This isn't about the law, Taine replied, his eyes locked on Sterling. This is about you and your greed. He took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling his lungs. He was about to make a stand, not with violence, but with a truth more powerful than any weapon. You have no claim on her. She is not property. She is my wife. The words fell into the silence, stunning the men into stillness. Sheriff Brody's jaw dropped. Sterling's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief, then fury. Under the laws of the territory, a wife was not responsible for the debts of a deceased former husband. Her legal identity was tied to her current one. A marriage, if it was real, would render Sterling's indenture contract worthless. You're lying, Sterling spat, his face turning a blotchy red. This is a trick. You have no proof, no certificate, no preacher. We don't need one, Taine said calmly. Under the law, if we live as man and wife and present ourselves as such, we are. It was then that May stepped forward, moving to stand beside Tyne. She faced Sheriff Brody directly, her small frame radiating an unexpected authority. Her voice when she spoke was clear and steady, her formal English cutting through the tension. "Sheriff Brodie," she said, "my first husband died in Mr. Sterling's mine. He died because the support timbers in Tunnel 4 were rotten. Mr. Sterling was told about them a week before the collapse." A flicker of panic appeared in Sterling's eyes. Lies. The ravings of a grieving woman. May ignored him, her gaze holding the sheriff's. "The shift foreman wrote it in his logbook. He told my husband he had warned Mr. Sterling himself. The foreman was a good man. He was dismissed the day after the collapse and sent away." She paused, letting her next words land with calculated weight. "His name was Connolly." The effect on Sheriff Brodie was immediate and profound. The colour drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly grey. The name Connolly had struck him like a physical blow. He remembered the rumours, the whispers, from years ago about a near disaster at another of Sterling's operations in the north, a scandal involving faulty equipment, and a foreman named Connolly, who had vanished after threatening to talk to the authorities. Sterling had buried it, using his money and influence to silence the story. But Brodie, as a lawman, had heard the whispers. He knew the story was true. May had just handed him a key, a weapon that could destroy Alistair Sterling. An official inquiry into the Argent Queen collapse, with a sworn statement about rotten timbers and a foreman named Connolly, would not just ruin Sterling's reputation, it would bring territorial marshals and federal investigators. It would uncover a pattern of negligence and corruption that could send him to prison. And Brodie knew with sickening certainty that Sterling would not hesitate to sacrifice him to save himself. His eyes darted from Sterling's enraged, panicked face to Thane's unyielding stare, and finally to May's dignified, courageous calm. He saw a man protecting his home, a woman demanding justice, and a tyrant whose power was built on a foundation of lies. In that moment, Sheriff Brodie made a choice. He chose survival. He crumpled the warrant in his fist. "This document is invalid," he said, his voice shaking slightly but firm. "The complaint is baseless. As for the indenture contract," he looked Sterling dead in the eye, "a marriage supersedes it. The matter is closed." "Brodie, you fool," Sterling roared, taking a step forward. One of Sterling's own hired men, seeing how the tide had turned, quietly put his hand on his employer's arm. "Sir," he murmured, "I think we should go." Defeated, exposed, and utterly humiliated, Sterling stood frozen for a moment, his malevolence warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Finally, he spun around, his face a mask of pure hatred, and stormed toward his horse. He mounted and rode away without a backward glance, his men scrambling to follow. Sheriff Brodie lingered for a moment. He looked at Tyne, then at May. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of grudging respect, perhaps even an apology. Then he too turned his horse and headed back down the mountain, leaving them alone in the quiet meadow. The threat was gone. They had won. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound peace settled over the homestead. The grey clouds had parted, and the sun cast long golden rays across the meadow. The air felt clean, washed new. Tyne slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. He looked at May, who was watching him, her dark eyes shining, with an emotion he could not quite name. The word he had spoken, wife, hung in the air between them, a declaration that had changed everything. It had started as a strategy, a legal shield, but in the moment he said it, he had realized it was the deepest truth of his heart. They went back inside the cabin, the space that was now, unequivocally, their shared sanctuary. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They moved through the familiar rhythms of their evening, May tending to the stew on the fire, Tyne cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. But the silence was different now. It was filled with a new intimacy, a shared understanding that went deeper than words. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of purple and rose, they sat at the table together. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm, gentle light on their faces. Tyne reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were small and calloused from her work in the garden, and they curled around his, fitting perfectly. "May," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "What I said out there, To Sterling. I meant it. He looked at her, his gaze steady and sincere. This place, it was just a shelter before you came, a place to hide from the ghosts. You made it a home again. I don't want to live here without you. He faltered, unaccustomed to laying his heart bare. I don't have much to offer, just this land, this cabin, a hard life, but it's a safe life. And it would be my honor if you would share it with me, as my wife, for real. A slow, beautiful smile spread across May's face, a smile that lit up her eyes and erased the last traces of fear and sorrow. She did not need flowery words or grand promises. She had seen the truth of his character in his actions. He was a good man, a strong man, a man who had stood between her and the darkness and had not flinched. Yes, she said softly, her voice thick with her own unshed tears. This is my home. You are my family. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of profound tenderness and respect. It was a vow, a silent promise to protect and cherish her for all their days. Later they stood together in the open doorway, looking out at the land that was theirs. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars she had watched from a world away, the same stars that had looked down on his years of lonely grief. But tonight they were not symbols of distance or loss, they were beacons of hope, witnesses to a new beginning. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his strength. Their two solitary lives finally, irrevocably, joined as one. In the vast, wild quiet of the high country they had found their peace, they had found their home.